Let's get going. The input statement is really easy in Python. It's just input, and then you open brackets, and inside the brackets you're going to put a phrase, and that phrase is going to be the prompt for the user. This doesn't do anything for us right now though, because we're not saving the input as it is. In order to save the input, you need to make a variable. So if I just put x equals, and then input, what is the value for x? And if I run this, I'll get a nice little prompt that says what's the value of x with a cursor behind it, so I could put the value of x as 6. Now once I put in that value, nothing happens because I've done nothing with x yet. So then I put the value for x is in quotation marks inside the print statement, then put a comma, then the variable x outside of quotation, so it's going to call the variable x, and whatever the value is for that, it will print out. So if I run this again, it says what's the value for x, I type in 6, it says the value for x is 6. So this is great. We've got some user input now. So if we continue on with this and put y equals input, and then set my print statement, I'm just going to put x plus y equals, that's going to be my print statement, and then it's going to equal x plus y. So that's what I'm going to do. So now I have input x, input y, and then print the value for x plus y equals x plus y. So when I run this, the value for x is 6, the value for y is 8, and I get x plus y equals 68. That is not mathematically correct, as we all know. So we've got to figure out what's happening here. So what's happening here is when you use the input statement, it makes an input with the value as a string. So if I put the value for x and the value for y as names, then when I print them out, it prints out the two strings back to back. Because what ends up happening with strings, you can add strings together in Python, and it just puts them, it concatenates them. So if we want to use these variables as numbers, we're going to have to tell it that we want them as numbers. So we can do that by just modifying our code just a little bit. So then x is going to be the int of the input, and same with y is going to be the int of the input. So by doing that, what we're going to do is we're going to convert or cast our variable as an integer. So we can run this now, and if we run it, and then what's the value for x, 6, what's the value for y, 3, and then I get x plus y is 9 if I do it that way. So now we have our values are taken in as numbers, so we'll just run it again, and what happens if I use some decimals? As soon as I put in a decimal, I get an error. It says invalid literal or int for int with a base 10. So what it's saying here is that we are using an invalid input for an integer. We can't have decimal places with an integer. But of course, that's going to be something we're going to want to do if we're doing any more complex calculations. So instead of an integer, what we can use is the float variable type. So instead of int, we'll just put float. So now when we run it, we can put in a decimal value and get our answers there. We can also mix integers and decimals, and it works fine. So now we have our integers working properly, our numbers working properly, our input statement is working as intended. One thing we're going to find when we have users inputting values, we're always going to have them messing it up too. That's just part of it. So if instead I put a string in for my integer value, I'm going to get the error. So what we can actually do, this is a little more advanced, but I want to introduce it here. We can actually start checking our user input. We can simply use a simple try statement, and they work really easy. You just put try, a full colon, and then you put whatever you want it to try to do. So I'm saying try to input x as a floating point value using the input. And then I'm going to put an exception. And if it doesn't work, it's going to print out invalid input. So now what's going to happen is when I try to put in a value for x, it's going to check to see if it can make it into a floating point. If it can't, it's going to say invalid input. So if I run this just to check it really quickly, put a value for x, invalid input, but then it still asks me for y. Now I'm running into another problem here. So now if I put a value in for y, now when it tries to add x plus y, I don't have a value for x, so now it gives me an error there. So we're going to have to figure out something else here. So in my exception statement, I'll set a value for x. X is 0. So if there is an exception, it'll print invalid input and also assign the value of x to 0. So now if we try it again, put in a string, it says invalid input, and then I put in another value for y, and it gives me an answer. The answer is now nonsensical. It doesn't really mean anything because I didn't put a value for x, but it's giving me a value for x. So we want to start thinking through our programs a little bit here. So what I'm going to do is I am thinking that I'm going to have to try and validate the inputs for both x and y. And if I can't do x, I don't want to do any more. If I can't do y, I don't want to do any more. So what I'm going to start doing is putting statements inside statements. So we're going to have we're going to start nesting here. So I can do this pretty quickly. So I have try to put x as a floating point. If it doesn't work, then we're going to get the exception, invalid input. But if it does work, then we're going to try to put our y. And only after we've already succeeded with x are we going to even try the y. Try to make a float out of x. And if that works, then we're going to try to make a float out of y. If we get an exception when we try to make our floating value for x, we'll print out invalid input. If we get an exception when we try to make our y a floating value, then we'll do the exact same thing. We will print invalid input again. But if we can make a value for x, we can make a value for y, then we are going to print out the value for x plus y. So what's going to end up happening here is we try to put our value for x. If we can do that, we're going to try to put our value for y. If we can do that, we're going to print out the sum of x and y. If we can't put a value for x, we're going to go to the first exception, which is invalid input. If we try to put a value for y and we can't do it, it's going to go invalid input for y. So we have a quick little program here that's just the only thing it's going to do is return the sum, but it works really well now. So what's the value for x? I will put in a value. What's the value for y? Put in another value, and it gives me my correct answer. If instead I try to run it, and I put in an invalid input for x, it immediately gives me an error that says invalid input. And likewise, if I run it, and I put in a proper value for x, but then I put in an improper value for y, it says invalid input for y. Either way, we run the program to termination. If we can take our input and validate our input, we're doing really well right now. One thing that's actually really good to do here is just do a little right triangle Pythagorean theorem program where you get the two values for the short sides and output the hypotenuse. Remember to make your print statements make a lot of sense so that the user knows what they've input and what the output means. You don't want to just have numbers show up on the screen. We want to have nice, clear statements telling the user both what to put in and also what the output means.